Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends, my name is Dr. Ian Phillips, and today we're going to be talking about Lindsey Graham and his death. If you guys don't know, Lindsey Graham is officially dead. He died at the age of 71 after what his office has called a brief and sudden illness. Again, this just happened here in probably the last 16 hours. And as always, what happens whenever a powerful politician dies in the United States and elsewhere, Washington has immediately activated a ceremonial laundry service. Right, the flags descend, the tributes appear, and former colleagues speak of friendship, humor, patriotism, and public service. Television producers assemble dignified photographs. Every moral compromise is translated into complexity. Every act of cowardice, though, becomes pragmatism. Every catastrophic policy becomes a deeply held conviction. And the deceased politician emerges from the machine scrubbed, pressed, and wrapped in the cloth linen of bipartisan respectability. But death is not an expungement, and it does not repeal votes, and it does not erase quotations. It does not restore the people injured by policies. It does not transform cruelty into statesmanship merely because its author can no longer defend it. So this is not a celebration of Lindsey Graham's death, right? This is also not a eulogy. This is going to be rather an audit. Because Lindsey Graham spent decades helping to construct an American political culture in which war was always available. Civilian death was always regrettable, but acceptable. Healthcare was always too expensive for ordinary people, and loyalty to power was always more important than consistency. And if Washington intends to describe him only as a colorful senator, a military veteran, and a charming bipartisan operator, then someone should mention what he actually did. So let's begin with Israel. At a public appearance responding to the growing number of Americans, including members of his own party, who opposed sending American money, weapons, and potentially American lives into another Middle Eastern war, Graham said, quote, and this is a direct quote, "I am not with you, I am with Israel." End quote. He continued by saying that he would remain with Israel until his dying day. Those were his words, not an accusation, not a manipulated headline, not an interpretation supplied by an anti-war activist. A United States senator looked at Americans demanding that their government put their country first, and he answered, "I am not with you, I am with Israel." That doesn't tell you what I think you need to know. I don't know what does, but political careers usually require consultants, historians, and investigators to identify their governing philosophy. Lindsey Graham placed his on a billboard. He was a senator from South Carolina discussing the prospect of South Carolinians sending their sons and daughters to war. And his immediate declaration of allegiance was not to those families. It was to a foreign government. Supporters will say that he meant that Israel was America's closest ally and that its security advanced American interest. Fine, make that argument. But there's something extraordinarily revealing about a senator responding to his own constituents with the language of rejection. Not persuasion, not explanation, rejection. I'm not with you, I'm with Israel. It was perhaps the most honest sentence of his career because Lindsey Graham had spent years demonstrating that when the interests of ordinary Americans collided with the appetites of the national security establishment, he knew exactly which side he was on. He was with the war, always. There was scarcely a conflict he could not imagine escalating. A country could be invaded, bombed, sanctioned, blockaded, destabilized, or threatened with regime change. And somewhere in Washington, Lindsey Graham would appear before a camera looking as excited as a Labrador hearing a can opener. He treated military force not as the final failure of diplomacy, but as the natural punctuation mark of foreign policy. A comma if the bombing was limited. Semicolon if ground troops might follow. Exclamation point if Iran was involved. This instinct reached its ugliest expression during Israel's destruction of Gaza. After Hamas committed atrocities on October 7th, Graham did not merely support Israel's right to defend itself, he embraced a moral logic in which almost every level of Palestinian civilian suffering could be absorbed into the word necessity. He compared the war to the destruction of Germany and Japan during World War II, and he invoked Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and asked why America had dropped 2 nuclear bombs. He defended the decision as necessary to end the war. A decision I think we all have defended at some point, at least many of us, most of us, members of the left and the right. I'm a favor of it. But then he said, give Israel the bombs they need to end the war. Now, precision matters. He did not explicitly say that Israel should use nuclear weapons on Gaza. Do not put words into his mouth. There is no need. The words that actually came out of his mouth are sufficiently monstrous. He used the atomic destruction of 2 cities, events that killed vast numbers of civilians, left generations living with radiation, disability, and trauma, as the moral analogy for what Israel should be permitted to do, and one of the most densely populated territories on Earth. And he did so at a demand the United States continue supplying the weapons. That is the point. He was not merely describing history, he was invoking the logic of total war towards, again, a group of people who, when the conflict first started, many moons ago, 80 years ago, 800,000 Palestinians were kicked out of their homes and forcibly removed if they resisted. The idea that once the enemy commits an atrocity, the distinction between combatant and civilian becomes an irritating technicality. Right? The idea that a population may be pulverized until its rulers surrender. The idea that the suffering of children becomes the unfortunate but tolerable price of demonstrating resolve. This is not strength. It is moral laziness wearing a flag pin. It requires no courage to demand unlimited violence from a television studio. The senator does not search through collapsed buildings. The senator does not identify the body. The senator does not explain to a child why the family's disappeared or sleeps among people's graves, as you've seen many pictures of. He says, Hiroshima and Nagasaki received applause from people who will never experience either, and proceeds to lunch. Graham's defenders will say that Hamas embedded itself among civilians, and that Hamas used tunnels in schools and hospitals, that Hamas intentionally made civilian protection difficult. All of that can be discussed seriously. But the existence of a criminal enemy does not relieve a government or the politicians supplying that government of moral responsibility. Let alone when people may be defending themselves. And if you put yourself in their shoes, you might understand why they're doing it, why they are committing atrocities, because atrocities were committed against them. But every atrocity becomes self-justifying. The enemy is evil. Therefore, restraint is weakness. And the enemy hides among civilians. Therefore, civilians become expendable. The enemy rejects international law. Therefore, we may reject it too. And before long, the difference between civilian and barbarism is merely, which side produced the press release. The winners write the history. Graham's attitude towards Palestinian life was not an isolated lapse. When asked whether there was some number of civilian deaths that would cause him to reconsider Israel's strategy, he effectively rejected the premise: no meaningful limit, no threshold at which human costs might become unacceptable, only victory, only destruction, only the endless reassurance that those ordering the bombing were the good people and those beneath it had selected the wrong geography. Then, we have other people as well in this whole debacle. I know we're only focusing on one segment of his entire political career here, but we have Greta Thunberg coming to the mix here. And in 2025, Thunberg joined activists attempting to bring symbolic humanitarian aid to Gaza by sea. Previous effort involving the flotilla had already faced allegations of a drone attack. And the danger was not imaginary. And Lindsey Graham, a sitting U.S. senator, responded by posting, "Hope Greta and her friends can swim." Consider the mentality required to write that. Somebody trying to provide humanitarian aid. Instead, he sides with the people who take machine guns and gun down civilians in aid lines. That's who he sides with. Now, a civilian vessel is attempting to reach a blockade population. People on board may be intercepted, attacked, injured, or thrown into the sea. And an elderly senator, secure on land, guarded by the state, and paid by the public, offers the humor of a schoolyard bully watching someone approach the ice. Hope they can swim. His defenders called it a joke. Cruel people are always comedians once anyone objects. It was a joke. And sometimes, hey, we can joke about things. I'm not going to say I'm above humor. I love humor, and I love dark humor too. But what I can tell you is time and place. And I can tell you this, he was dead serious. The atomic bomb analogy was historical context. The civilian deaths were Hamas's responsibility, healthcare cuts were state flexibility, Trump's submission was party unity, and every act had a euphemism. Every outrage came with a professionally prepared translation. But character is what remains after the translations are removed. And Graham's character was perhaps the most visible in his relationships with Donald Trump. So we'll transition there. In 2015 and 2016, Lindsey Graham understood Trump perfectly. He called him a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot. He called him a nut job. He called him a loser, demagogue, a man without a clue. He said Trump was exploiting prejudice and the dark side of politics. He told Trump to go to hell. He warned that if Republicans nominated him, they would be destroyed, and they would deserve it. This was not a misunderstanding. Graham's original diagnosis was clinically precise. Then Trump won. And Lindsey Graham discovered that the race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot possessed invitations to the White House. access to presidential power, and a golf course. Suddenly, the demagogue was charming. The nutjob was funny. Suddenly, the loser was a friend. And Graham openly described his desire to enter Trump orbit so that he could influence events. He liked that the president called him. He found the attention flattering, and then became one of the most shameless examples of political submission in modern Washington. Trump insulted Graham's closest friend, John McCain. Graham remained. Trump mocked McCain's military service and experience and continued attacking him after his death. Graham remained. Trump then attempted to deny an election and say that it was all fraudulent, that the Democrats stole an election, and that Joe Biden was somebody who did not deserve office. He didn't get the most votes, and that this is a man who stole it fraudulently. He broke the law to get his votes, something that has been challenged in court numerous times and rejected on various different grounds. But after January 6th, Graham took the Senate floor and declared, "Count me out. Enough is enough." Now, I don't believe that Donald Trump tried to overthrow the government on January 6th, because if he did, I think he would have tried to act on it a lot differently. Was there potential there? Certainly. And does he deny that election was something that was legitimate? Absolutely. And do I disparage him for that? Absolutely. And does the White House page remain a stain on the legacy of the United States? Absolutely. But, after that, on January 6th, Graham took the Senate floor and he declares, "Count me out, enough is enough." It was the closest that he came to locating a vertebral column. The discovery was temporary, however, and within months, Graham said the Republican Party could not move forward without Trump. And shortly before his death, he stood beside the man he once called a dangerous bigot and told him, "Mr. President, you're not far behind God." There, in one political career, is the complete degradation of the Republican establishment. From go to hell to you are nearly divine. In some respects, you'd think we'd almost live in the show The Boys, where Homelander comes down, sort of acts as if he's God. So, not because Trump became wiser did he make these exclamations. Not because he became more decent. Not because he apologized to John McCain. Because he became powerful. Graham's loyalty did not follow virtue. It followed access. He was a weather vane that mistook proximity to the storm for influence over the weather. And then there was healthcare. Healthcare is always my litmus test, and so I had to throw it in my little essay here. It would be inaccurate to say that Lindsey Graham opposed every major healthcare bill ever written. He sometimes supported particular programs and funding measures. But on the most important question of the last generation, whether the United States should expand access to affordable healthcare insurance, his record was unmistakable. And that's just insurance, let alone the idea of a universal system like every major country on the face of the planet in the Western world. He voted against the Affordable Care Act. He supported efforts to repeal it. And when other Republican repeals plans failed, he attached his own name to Graham Cassidy. The proposal would have dismantled central structures of the Affordable Care Act, ended its Medicare expansion, replaced major federal healthcare subsidies with temporary state block grants, and imposed permanent limits on traditional Medicaid funding. The Congressional Budget Office concluded that the federal Medicaid spending would fall by roughly $1 trillion over a decade. And that's not for the same healthcare access. That's to rip people off of healthcare. Watch them suffer. Meanwhile, he has the best insurance the money can buy. Millions fewer people would be covered. Understand what $1 trillion in Medicaid reductions means outside the spreadsheet. It means the poor, it means disabled children, it means elderly people in nursing facilities, pregnant women, people requiring home care, families whose medical needs did not disappear simply because a senator found the federal budget, aesthetically displeasing. Graham called his plan flexibility. Of course he did. Washington's favorite method of cutting a service is to transfer responsibility downward without transferring enough money, and then describe the resulting desperation as local control. The federal government removes the funding, the state makes the cuts, the hospital closes the department, the patient loses coverage, and every politician involved claims someone else made the decision. Graham did not lack governmental health care himself. Again, he enjoyed the coverage, the salary, the security, the privileges associated with serving in Congress. The austerity was for other people. That is a recurring feature of American conservatism. And I'm not going to excuse the Democrats either, because they oftentimes find themselves in the same boat. But publicly financed medicine, does not necessarily just become socialism precisely because it is 1 inch outside the center of his body. Ooh, there's a quote right there. But then we were told to admire his service. And that's where I draw the line. I say, this is where Washington's obituary ritual becomes intolerable to me. Because service, to me, is not a magic word. A person may serve in government for decades and use that service to produce suffering. And again, this is on both sides of the aisle. If you were to tell me, Dr. Phillips, go ahead, look at Nancy Pelosi's record then, if you want to, criticize Lindsey Graham. And I'll say I hate her just as much. She is a pretty terrible human being. The insider trading has lived on in this country for generations. But, when you become the poster child of it, I don't believe that you're above criticism. And I don't believe that Lindsey Graham is above criticism either. And so again, I'm not celebrating his death, right? But again, this is not an obituary, right? I'm not going to sit here and only say the good. I also want to let the American people know what his stances were. I'm sure Graham could be personable. He could be funny. He had friendships across party lines. He endured genuine hardship in his early life and helped care for his younger sister after their parents died. He served in the military. All of those things may be true. And we can say, hey, look, you were a good guy for that. Human beings are rarely cartoons, though. You got to understand there's the good and the bad. But personal warmth does not neutralize public cruelty. A politician can be kind to colleagues and merciless toward strangers. He can remember birthdays and vote to remove health care. He can charm journalists and call for bombing campaigns. He can love individual people and treat distant populations as expendable extractions. The most dangerous political figures are not always incapable of infection. They simply restrict their moral concern to people they recognize. Lindsey Graham recognized presidents, generals, prime ministers, senators, donors, television hosts. He could see their humanity perfectly. A Palestinian child was a statistic. A Medicaid recipient in our own country was a budget line. The American soldier was a symbol of resolve. The anti-war constituent was someone with whom he was not. That was his politics. Upward empathy, downward discipline. Endless indulgence for the powerful. Endless sacrifice demanded from everyone else. So no, I'm not going to call him, the worst names in the book here. But he's a guy who deserves that criticism. And I think, look, as somebody who is, not part of that inner circle, maybe I might never understand where he's coming from. But what I can tell you is, as an American, and as somebody who's looking out for my fellow Americans, the poor, the rich alike, and not just my fellow Americans, but citizens of the globe, the Palestinians, and practically every other country in between, I sympathize with you. And I don't think that only people like Lindsey Graham should benefit from their position in office. I believe the entire world should. And I'm here to call that out. So again, I'll leave you with a final quote here, again, from Lindsey Graham. He said, quote, "I'm not with you, I'm with Israel." So take that how you will as a sitting U.S. senator, saying that he's not with you. He's with Israel. But he was elected to serve the United States. If that doesn't tell you what his career is, I don't know what does, ladies and gentlemen. But with that said, guys, obviously it's never a good thing to see people die. It's always a very sad thing. But in the same breath, too, we're not gonna whitewash his record here. We're not gonna say, look, you had a phenomenal record your entire life. We're gonna celebrate you for it, because he didn't. People need to at least be honest with yourselves here. If you want to support the guy, that's fine. Obviously, that's your prerogative. As an American in a democracy, that's your prerogative. Hey, that's how he got elected in the first place. People clearly wanted him in power. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend that this guy was some hero. I won't do it. And with that said, I don't think you should either. At least be honest with yourselves about this and say, okay, look, he was a person who had a legacy in the United States. And leave it at that, a person to be studied. Maybe in the future generations, people will say, look, he was a product of his time when you could have organizations like AIPAC donate substantial amounts of money. And corporations had the same voice, if not more powerful than people are. Maybe he's a product of his time. And maybe we need to recognize that. And maybe in the future we will study that. But for now, I think it's important that in order to get that ball rolling, we make that distinction clear. So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, obviously, if you did enjoy the video, you can hit subscribe for some more content like this. Sometimes I do little scripts. Sometimes I just go off the top with respects to news and some daily content here. But you can find me on social media at Ian Phillips USA. And with that said, we'll talk to you later, guys. Peace.